Good afternoon. I should preface that by saying good afternoon, intrepid audience, coming out in this yucky afternoon of snow/rain. But thank you. It's so good to see all of you for the conclusion of our winter lecture series. I am Melissa Giuseppiak. I'm the director of Essex Historical Society, and EHS extends our heartfelt thanks to Susan Carpenter, Victoria Eichhorn, and the team at Essex Meadows for hosting this year's winter lecture series at this very gracious facility. This year's series highlights local history during the American Revolution, paving the way for the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 2026. Using this date as a marker, the 250th anniversary of the U.S. is also known as the semi-quincentennial, aka the semi-Q, celebrating all of our country's history from indigenous peoples to the present. EHS will feature a number of US 250 programming over the next 2 years, beginning with this series. EHS can bring you this quality lecture series for free, as are most of our programs, thanks to the generous support from our membership, people just like you, who ensure that everyone has free access to local history. At the end of today's talk, please speak with one of our board members or EHS's outreach coordinator, Kate Savage, at the welcome table in the back to learn more about EHS, our events, and our membership program. Or please visit our website, www.essexhistory.org, sign up for our email list, or follow us on Facebook or Instagram. Not TikTok. We thank you in advance. Now on to this afternoon's speaker. Damien Cregeau earned his bachelor's degree in history from Hillsdale College and his master's degree in history from Colorado State. He is an award-winning scholar of the American Revolution who has spoken throughout the Northeast, from Boston to Washington, D.C. He has been published in numerous journals over the past decade, and his forthcoming book, Profiles of Patriots, Colonel John Trumbull and 5 fellow patriots from Connecticut in the American Revolution, will be published in 2025. His talk this afternoon highlights one of those portraits in A Family at War, Colonel Jedediah Huntington and Faith Trumbull Huntington at the outset of the Revolution, 1774 to 1775. Please join me in welcoming Damien Cregeau.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, Melissa. Melissa and I have known each other for many years, just like I've known last week's speaker, Jerry Roberts, for many years. But Melissa and I go way back to our mutual connections in Wethersfield, up the river from here in Essex. It's so wonderful to be back here. Most of you may not remember me, but I spoke here 3 times, not once but twice, but 3 times in 2013 and 2014 right here in this room. And that was around the time there was some musical called Hamilton, so I was thinking like, okay, this is the Hamilton room. I'm trying to think, Alexander Hamilton never came to this area. Marquis de Lafayette did. And I thought, boy, the next time I come back here, I'll have to do something about Alexander Hamilton. If you want, you can watch me on C-SPAN talking about Alexander Hamilton. I've spoken twice at his grave in New York City, and then you can see the C-SPAN talk if I don't wind up doing it here right in person. And on that note, thanks to everyone who's watching me, I guess, through Channel 45 here in-house. How unfortunate there's been a bit of a flu outbreak, but the wonders of modern technology. Change is sometimes actually a good thing. Technology can be both a backwards and forwards frustrating mix. But at any rate, thanks again for having me at Essex Historical Society and Essex Meadows. Wonderful to be back. So this is going to be an interesting experience because we're going to be dovetailing your traditional history with some women's history and art history. So it'll be an interesting medley, an interesting mix. And it's wonderful to blend the presentations that I've done on them into one large presentation. My wife, who is a trauma psychologist sitting here, my wife, dear wife Pam, she has given talks about the depression of Faith Trumbull, as well as her artwork. And then, of course, I handle the historical side. So it's wonderful to put these two into this wonderful blend for you, to give you a portrait of what it's like to be prominent, distinguished here in Connecticut, and yet still have such difficult troubles. It can affect people of any social class and what happened. So with that, I had to give a humorous opening link to last week's talk. If you were here like I was for the sold-out jam talk by my friend Jerry Roberts, he talked about the turtle, and I had to include this in the beginning. There's me and Pam right down the road from here, as you know, in the Connecticut River Museum, tucked inside the turtle. So, you know the expression we were just, I like the TikTok shut down overnight, that was in the works. So now we have the expression selfies. So there are selfies, and then there are selfies. So presenting artificial intelligence. Before we go into the talk itself, there is me done using artificial intelligence in the school of John Trumbull. And yes, I decided that would be fun to have as my Facebook profile photo. And then we made this a year ago. A buddy of mine from college, he is a chief information security officer for Coke. So he has all these, electronic toys in his office. He said, "Hey, let's make a portrait of you." And I said, "Okay." I'm trying to think, like, what are we going to do here? 1930s? No. Oh, I know, School of John Trumbull. That'll be so fun. So it's amazing what computers can do, right? And what's fun is I did that in the School of John Trumbull, and these are actual paintings by John Trumbull, and we own the reproductions of them. The one on the left is Jedediah's father, Jedediah Huntington. Sadly, his mother was not painted. Sorry, ladies. But there's Jedediah to the right, the son, the firstborn son, as a miniature. And I have held these paintings. They're lovely ones up in the Connecticut State Museum in downtown Hartford. The other one is at what used to be called for many years the Connecticut Historical Society. And so they pulled that out of the vault for me, the miniature that's on the right. And you'll see we did a special reproduction of it, a reinterpretation of the reproduction. His childhood home, Colonel Jedediah Huntington, this is in Norwich. We came from our house, you'll see that we own in a minute. But where was he born and raised? Across the street at the General Jabez Huntington House. And this is in Norwich town. Raise your hand if you've ever been to Norwich. Oh, wow, a lot more hands than I expected. Wonderful. There's a great art museum there, the Slater Museum, so that could be a potential field trip for all of you in advance sometime. That's a great place to go. And the architecture is incredible, and the history, that's what drew us. My father was an architect here in Connecticut from 54 to 2004. In fact, he graduated. You have a new resident here, Jared Airwoods, who was here last week. He graduated from Yale Architecture School about 6 years after my dad did. Jedediah Huntington, he's born in 1743. He graduates from Harvard in 1763, 20 years old, and he's second in his class. Class ranking in those days based on his socioeconomic standing. So it shows how prominent he is. Yeah, Harvard did it a little differently back in the day. I guess Yale did too. I did look up who was number one. I can't think of the name. I should have had it handy. He's a bright young man. He's the first to deliver his valedictorian address in English. Ooh, right up until then it was done in Latin. Can you imagine? Right up until 62 in Latin. I can't imagine sitting through that address. He becomes a wealthy merchant like his father and his grandfather before him. Then I have to introduce the future father-in-law, because he is in the General Assembly with Jabez Huntington, and that is Jonathan Trumbull Sr. I know it gets a little confusing if you know anything about the Trumbull family. They keep using the same names over and over again. There's Jonathan Sr., there's Jonathan Jr., and then there's the painter, John. So you can imagine Dad is Jonathan, Jonathan Jr., John, who knows what they must have had nicknames. I know that John Trumbull, the painter, went by Jack. I know that from doing the research to write my book that we'll talk about at the end. But for the purposes of this talk, we're talking about Dad first, who's a graduate of Harvard, 1727, and he marries Faith Robinson Trumbull in Lebanon in 1735. You can see her pictured here. And then both of those double portraits that you're seeing on the right side were done by their son, John Trumbull. So, both double portraits are done by their soon-to-be distinguished son, John Trumbull. And you can see the earlier one with Dad wearing a wig, the old English style, in the upper portrait. Dad, Jonathan Trumbull Jr., long before he becomes governor, is a young member of the General Assembly. In fact, the youngest member in 1740, basically the State House. He's going to become a prominent merchant. Notice, by the way, that in these portraits, they look like they're wearing, house coats, bathrobes, whatever you want to call them. There's some kind of fancy name for it. I can't think of it at the moment. Banyan, yes, thank you. The young Faith Trumbull, where does she grow up? Well, this is her parents' house, so Jonathan and Faith. And the young Faith, who's named after her mom, of course, she's born in 1742 in this beautiful home that's located on Lebanon Green. At age 11, can you imagine such a young age, she is sent with her sister and a female cousin to finishing school up in Boston. It's a long journey, especially in those days, to learn needlepoint under this woman named Elizabeth Murray. And she becomes a talented artist by the time she is 15, and you're about to see why. This is the first of several of her overmantles, meaning these large needlepoint embroideries are done. They're roughly 5 to 6 feet across and roughly about 2 feet high. And they hung over fireplace mantles at the house that you just saw in several of the rooms. And she did this first one, can you believe it, at the age of 11. So nowadays we joke about the kids who are on their phones doing this with their thumbs. Well, back in those days, they could pull this off at age 11. I think I know which one I would take. Same kind of amazing detail. Look at this skill and talent that she had at such a young age. These have been featured in several period books like Women's Needlework of 18th Century New England, books like that, coffee table books, published in Boston and here in Connecticut over the decades. This was her second one, also in the archives of the Connecticut Historical Society. That's the name I'm going to use because it was used for the last century plus. My wife and I were very lucky to get to see these originals in the storage drawers, and you'll see why momentarily. And this is her third one. This is more square in its design. Thankfully, it fits between the windows in our house, in our dining room. She did this at the ripe old age of 13. So basically doing one a year here. Amazing. This one was done based on a Dutch print. They were able to find that funky hat, if you want to call it that. Something like you'd see at a coronation or something nowadays in the Dutch print. And that's what how they know that she used that as a model. Faith's early adulthood is that she will return to Boston several times. The one I'm mentioning here is that she returns to Boston at 18 for further education, hosted by the Lovell family. They're pretty prominent. There's a guy named James Lovell who will become important in American intelligence and the American Revolution. She will attend the prestigious Boston Latin School, arguably the oldest school in the United States, still exists. Her younger brother John, the famous painter, decades later, when Faith's about 18 or 19, she and her sister are roughhousing with their younger brother John. Apparently there was great chemistry with them, and he was this little energetic bug, and they're doing their usual thing, teasing, chasing, and maybe he's playing hide and go seek or something on the second floor of the house that you saw, that white colonial. And he falls down the back staircase, the service staircase. And unfortunately, when he fell, it was so traumatic, he became blind in one eye. So what's incredible is that you have such an incredible painter who becomes so famous, one of the three great painters in early American history, who's blind in one eye. Faith also has two gentlemen who are interested in her romantically. One is pictured here on the right, William Williams. He's a neighbor of hers from down the street. His house still stands in Lebanon at the busy intersection there by the brick church. William Williams will go on to become one of the 4 Connecticut signers of the Declaration of Independence. Pretty amazing. She turns him down because the other one was Jedediah Huntington, who she would have met through his father and her own father. So Jabez Huntington, who you saw early in this talk, and Jonathan Trumbull Sr., who eventually becomes governor, they're both members of the General Assembly. So they're getting to know each other, professionally, and they are both prominent merchants. So that must have been how they were introduced socially. And both were observant Congregationalists, both the families as well as, of course, the children. And you pick that up in the religious wording of the writings, in the letters that I've held, which is just an amazing experience to have. A lot of the people in her family refer to Faith as Faithy. That was kind of her nickname, kind of like Jack for John Trumbull. So occasionally I'll use Faithy instead of Faith. This is a couple of important, powerful years in their lives. They are engaged at this point. They announced their engagement in April of 1765, and then get married several weeks later. So the engagement is announced in the local newspaper, and then they get married in, did I say 65? Jed knows he's going to get married to Faith. So he starts building this house, and it takes over a year to build it, and this is in the center of Norristown, just off the green, Norristown Green, and UCFS properties. And Jabez, that father, the wealthy merchant, this shows how much wealth they had. He said to his mere 23-year-old son, here's the land, we're going to build this beautiful house, and there's the finished product. Obviously a recent photo. And so they get engaged as the construction is being completed into spring of 1766, and they get married on May 1st. And so I have this photo from around May 1st, and maybe that's roughly what the foliage would have looked like, the leaves coming out on the trees and spring flowers and such. And it was the tradition in those days in colonial New England. Most of the time you got married at your house. You did not get married at churches. And funerals are often held in your houses as well, as we're going to find out at the end of this presentation. And there's the center hall with the fancy staircase made of mahogany and some artwork by copies of artwork. Goodness, we're not a museum, so the originals are priceless. The originals by John Trumbull, of course, these 4 panels are the 4 that hang in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, which, because the inauguration tomorrow is moved inside, we'll see a lot of those portraits in the background tomorrow afternoon over the crowd's heads. Well, it's personal for us because my wife and I were lucky enough, we looked everywhere at houses, including here in Essex. We looked at Southport, Stonington, Sharon, Salisbury here, but we chose this house over everyone because this house had such incredible architecture and history to it, as you're going to hear some of today. And it just so happened, as luck would have it, that we bought it on the 250th anniversary of its construction. So 1765, 250 years later is 2015. And we had the closing in May, about the same date as they would have gotten married, so it's lovely. And there we are, and I'm holding a sign that says, history in the making. So the Trumbulls and the Huntingtons, a lot is going on in this 3-year period. Faith's father, Jonathan Trumbull Sr., is going to become a lot more important in Connecticut politics. He had become lieutenant governor in 1766. This was because of the response to the Stamp Act of 1765 by the British Parliament. And you could basically say that Jonathan Trumbull and William Pitkin, the governor at that time, were the more political radicals. They were basically associated with the Sons of Liberty and this group that wanted to represent Connecticut in a more prominent stature, just like all the other colonies wanted more representation in Parliament. They felt like if you're going to tax us, we need to be represented. We need to come across the pond, as we nowadays say, and be there in British Parliament to represent our colonies. Pitkin, unfortunately, is going to die in office in October 1st of 1769, and that will promote then Jonathan Trumbull, Faith's father, from lieutenant governor to governor. And in the meantime, Jed and Faith have had their first child, Jabez, born September 17th, 1767. And we will see what young Jabez looks like in a few minutes. This is Faith's 4th and final embroidery. This is in 1770, a year later. And what do we know about that year? The Boston Massacre that had taken place, the 250th of which was just several years ago. It has been long misattributed to her mom, Faith Robinson Trumbull. So Faith Trumbull, the young wife of Jedediah, is probably the one who actually did this embroidery. And that's for a number of reasons. First off, we've just seen how talented she was with these other 3 embroideries. And secondly, her mom, Faith Robinson Trumbull, there's no indication she ever did embroidery. So at the Lyman Allen Museum, where this is, in New London, where it's been for decades, it's long been misattributed. And the curator of American arts and I both believe that this is indeed the work of Faith Trumbull Huntington. Then it was done in 1770 as a response, and you can see the black silk that it's on. So you have silk and metal thread, very interesting. And my wife and I saw this hung on display for a special exhibit. several years ago. When you see it in person, like any other work of art, you pick up a lot of the textures that you can't see on a slide on the internet or on a show like this. It's titled The Hanging of Absalom, which is an Old Testament story. We don't have time to go into that biblical story. But basically, Absalom is riding on a horse and gets his hair caught in a tree. So Absalom is hanging from the tree there in the middle of the illustration. And there's a whole story about what happens to him. It's supposed to be King David to the left playing his harp, completely unaware of Absalom's unlucky fate. And then you see there's somebody there with what looks like some kind of spear poking at Absalom and hanging haplessly in the tree as that horse gallops off. Well, it's my assertion, along with the help of my wife, that we believe that this is in response specifically to the Boston Massacre of 1770. So that was March 1st that event took place. And that this King David on the left is actually King George III, unaware of the plight, the suffering of people who were represented like Absalom, whether it's Crispus Attucks or others, and that this person who's wearing the red coat, of course, is a red coat or regular British soldier, and they had been occupying Boston since 1768. And most Bostonians, unless they were loyalists, did not like having the British occupy their places, and you know that came out in the Declaration of Independence, made famous by Thomas Jefferson and all these grievances that people like Bostonians had. This is the portraits of Faith and her father, and I wanted to juxtapose these. It was so emotional. I had been looking for well over a decade for the portrait of any likeness that I could get, hopefully some kind of painting portrait, which I eventually found, of Faith Trumbull Huntington, this talented artist, because her younger brother had said, the would-be famous John Trumbull says in his autobiography, "My sister is the one," she's 9 years older, "she's the one who inspired me to become the great painter I became." She was such a talented artist. She didn't do just the embroideries, but she did apparently some paintings, including landscapes. Unfortunately, the landscapes are lost, or any other paintings of any kind. We don't know where they were, where they wound up. But John Trumbull does talk about them, so that's the documentation for this. So we were always wondering, well, then why didn't he paint his sister? Well, even if he didn't, it turns out somebody else had, assuming that this is not a self-portrait. Miraculously, I found this while on vacation. We had been in Colonial Williamsburg, my wife and I, on vacation back in late November, and it was just after leaving Williamsburg. We were then in North Carolina, where all the devastation was, in Lake Lure, bringing some relief supplies and enjoying ourselves as well. And I go on there, I said, I've got to check, because it's right about this time of year, around Thanksgiving, that I know that something tragic happened in Faith's life. I have to check her date of death. And I look and I said, oh, it's November 24th. Okay, good, that's what I thought. And I went, what's this illustration of her? And that pops up on Wikipedia, and I said, I better fact check this. It's like find a grave. You have to make sure as a historian that these are factually based. And I went back and I looked and heard this illustration that you're seeing in black and white. We don't know where it is. We don't know who owns it, therefore, not even what state. It's from a 1901 magazine publication by the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution. And I immediately realized that for decades after this 1901 publication, her likeness was being misattributed as her mother. And yet, if you look at her mom, I know these aren't the best illustrations, but if you look at her mom, she looks nothing like her. Who does she look like? She looks like her dad. You can see the dad on the right in the lower portrait, and then the left. And so I wish the upper one were higher resolution, but that's the best I can get on the internet. These are both in Hartford. And yet John Trumbull, the painter, looks like his mother, Faith Robinson, the one with the white scarf on her head there. So, interesting article that I'm going to publish this year about Faith and all of the findings I did in the course of writing my book. So, now I can go back to the firstborn child for Jedediah, and that's the son that he will have with Faith. In 1772, Faith and Jed surrender for whatever reason. In other words, they hand over their 5-year-old son, Jabez, to Faith's parents. That's Governor Jonathan Trumbull, here on the right, and his wife, Faith Robinson. Why? It's unclear. Maybe it was for schooling. We're not quite sure. A lot of these kids were sent off to school a lot younger than we would imagine. He's only about 5 years old at that point, so that would seem a little young, but then again, it was his own grandparents, and he was only going about nowadays what we would consider a 15-minute drive from the home. So we were going to be able to see each other frequently, but he must have been homesick in a way. So Jabez is then raised in that white colonial house that is at this point considered the governor's mansion, and he goes to local school. And there he is, painted around age 9 or 10 on the left, young as Pam and I like to call him, young baby Jabez on the left, born in 1767. And there is his uncle on the right, John Trumbull, painting himself. That's his selfie from 1777. So he painted his nephew about the same year. Isn't that wonderful? And as you can see, the Jabez on the left is in the collection at Yale, and the one on the right of John Trumbull is at Boston's MFA, Museum of Fine Arts. Jedediah becomes quite the patriot leader in Norwich, or even eastern Connecticut. He's promoted to captain of militia in 1774, specifically May, and then he's promoted to colonel just a few months later in charge of the Connecticut's 20th Regiment. He's also, more importantly, a member of the Norwich chapter of the Sons of Liberty. You might have seen some TV series about the Sons of Liberty or heard about them in books. There's been a lot of good scholarly research about the Sons of Liberty. The Norwich chapter seemed to have been run by Colonel John Durkee, and then he had assistance from his friends Christopher Leffingwell and Jedediah Huntington, along with others. And they were basically upset about the Boston coming under siege, but starting off with the Stamp Act in 1765, which affected all the port cities, like New London and Norwich, not just Boston, and then all of the other acts that came out of British Parliament after the repeal in 1766 of that Tea Act, including the Intolerable Acts. He's also, Jedediah that is, a member of Norwich's Committee of Correspondence, and that will become important because following the Boston Tea Party in 1773, the British decided as a response to have these so-called Intolerable Acts, and they closed the port of Boston, they shut it down, and the people consequently suffered. It didn't matter your political leanings, loyalist or otherwise, and they began to starve. They were having shortages on food and all other kinds of basics. So they reach out for help, and Norwich responds in amazing fashion. They send, and this is all based on real letters that I've read. In July of 1774, 291 sheep, I know exactly the numbers, you'll see in a minute, are gathered in Norwich and sent to Boston. That must have been quite the noisy scene. And then later cash, wheat, corn, and a second flock of sheep are sent to Boston. And the Bostonians are very appreciative. And here are their famous leaders' responses. First, in August of 1774, a letter from Samuel Adams, famous household name, right? A great founding father, patriot. Quote, "The part which the town of Norwich takes in this struggle for American liberty is truly noble," end quote. And then weeks later, one of his famous colleagues, Dr. Joseph Warren, pictured in the lower right as you see, "Your letter with the 291 sheep," and that's how we know the exact number, it's not rounded off to 300, "were received safely and met with a very hearty welcome. We have good reason to think that our oppressors," in other words the British, "will see their mistake, and that they will ere long be convinced that Americans are not to be frittered or wielded out of their rights. The arm of a tyrant is never supported by justice, and therefore must fall." It's an ominous sign of impending war. We can look back, but they didn't know what was coming next. The storm clouds were brewing. So, we know that April 19th is famously referred to as what? Patriots Day. And it's coming soon, the 250th anniversary this coming spring, just a couple months away. And of course it entails the battles of Lexington and Concord. News carried via express riders of these surprise skirmishes between the British regular redcoats and the militia at these two towns. And one of those express riders was Israel Bissell, who rode from Concord to Worcester, Mass, the city, and then changed horses. That first horse actually died from exhaustion. He gets on a second horse and then goes down basically the route of what we would consider modern day Interstate 395 from Worcester down to Norwich. And as he's passing south, of course, he's going to go through modern day Pomfret, Putnam, Brooklyn, and he's going to stop off and see Israel Putnam and gives him the news. And of course, Putnam famously drops his plows and picks up his musket, gets on his horse, and, as you know, gallops off to Boston. The legendary Israel Putnam, who Jedediah Huntington, by the way, will serve under in the American Revolution at one point, including at the Reading encampment here in Connecticut, down in Fairfield County, which is a beautiful state park. When Bissell arrives in Norwich, he goes to Leffingwell Tavern. That's Christopher Leffingwell's. And Jedediah Huntington happens to be there, and Jed immediately reads the news and then musters his militia, and they will march off. And it takes over a week for them to get to Boston area via Providence. And of course, by the time they get there, there's no actual battle actions going on. So it becomes what we could jokingly call sitzkrieg, the term blitzkrieg from World War II. Well, it was a sitzkrieg, so a lot of sitting around and waiting to see what the British might do next. Bissell will continue on from Norwich, right down through this part of Connecticut, and possibly all the way to Philadelphia, we're not sure. But certainly he rode quite a few many miles than Paul Revere ever did, and yet unfortunately, because there's no poem about Israel Bissell, people don't hear about him as much, and yet he deserves all kinds of accolades for the hundreds of miles that he did, in fact, ride. 1775, of course, being the opening year of the American Revolution, is going to have quite an impact on Jedediah and Faith as a couple. A pivotal role Jed does as a colonel. He's going to run his own regiment, and he leaves with no goodbyes, and of course that is unfortunate for Faith. She's going to be worried about his status the whole time. In April of 75, she is worried and writes to him, quote, "May you be under the protection and direction of heaven, endowed with the health and hope and trust in the God of Jacob, is the earnest prayer of her," meaning herself, "who in the strictest bond of love and duty is ever your affectionate wife." Beautiful writing. So you can see how religious she is. She's very deep in her faith, thanks to the impact from her very religious father, Jonathan, the governor, and also how much Jedediah and she love each other. And then in May, she writes, or it's rather Brother John Trumbull, the painter, will get commissioned. So this is Faith's brother, John, who gets commissioned. He will eventually serve briefly as an aide to General George Washington, doing some sketches for him of British earthworks, and then he moves on and performs many other roles throughout the American Revolution. His sister-in-law is also upset, and in addition, Joshua is commissioned. So Jedediah's brother, Joshua, is now in the militia besieging Boston, and it's Joshua's wife, Hannah, is upset. So the point here in this little bracket, this little line, is 3 different wives, not just Faith, are concerned about the safety, the well-being of their husbands. It's just Faith who will take it the hardest, as we're going to see. Jed gets all these letters of worry and religion intermixed with despair in the letters throughout the months, May, June, July. And he does come home to help cheer the ladies up and say, look, it's going to be okay, we're at camp. And he decides they're going to gather the ladies and take them to Dedham, Massachusetts for a family reunion with their own brothers or in-laws. In the meantime, what's so powerful is that in the course of my doing research for my book that's coming out this year, is to be, in some cases, the first person to transcribe some of these letters. In this case, 6 letters or more at the Connecticut State Museum's archives in Hartford, which are part of course, the Connecticut State Library. This is down in the basement. In particular, there's 6 letters between Faith and Jed. Some of the letters are at Yale, but the letters that I transcribed were another set of 6 letters that no one else had ever transcribed at the Connecticut State Library, as I said. And I transcribed these in November of 2022. There's also a poignant letter from Jabez, the young son, that you had seen pictured at a young age, to his father, Jed, in 1775, that I was also the first to transcribe. And it's amazing to see, for example, and hold these letters. Here's a sample of Faith writing to her husband, Jed, and I'll show you little clips of what she says in here. This is the letter, and then she says in here, she starts off with "Dear Sir," which is amazing. It's like, wow, you refer to your husband as "Dear Sir." Oh, interesting. And then she closes, "Your affectionate wife," etc., and then she's basically talking about her despondent mental state. In response to the letter that I just showed you, that she had written in May, Jed planned another brief return to Norwich to retrieve his wife and others. And they decided that they're going to travel via Providence in a carriage and bring everyone back to Boston. And the problem is the carriage has a wheel break somewhere near Providence. They have to spend the night in a tavern while the wheelwright is fixing the wheel, so things aren't going well on the drive. And then it's like the old days when your car would overheat on a long road trip back in the 60s or 70s, right? And then it included Faith plus Jonathan Trumbull Jr., her older brother. He's pictured there on the left with his wife Eunice and their daughter Faith. Faith's not part of this trip, this young girl who's named after her aunt as well as her grandmother. But those, I'm showing this so you can see the likeness of the two of the parents who are going to go, along with Joshua's wife, Hannah. So they're all going to go up there, and they head into Roxbury, which is only 4 miles from the scene of Bunker Hill. When did they get there? Just 2 days after the battle on June 17th. The Battle of Bunker Hill is June 17th. They arrive about the 19th. And that's really unlucky timing for the impact it will have on her mental health. And we know that because years later, he becomes famous, John Trumbull the painter. He writes an autobiography late in his life in the 1830s, and it gets published, and he writes the following. About noon of that day, I had a momentary interview with my favorite sister, the wife of Colonel, afterwards General Jedediah Huntington, whose regiment was on its march to join the army. The novelty of military scenes excited great curiosity through the country, and my sister was one of a party of young friends who were attracted to visit the army before Boston. She was a woman of deep and affectionate sensibility, and the moment of her visit was most unfortunate. She found herself surrounded not by the pomp and circumstance of glorious war, but in the midst of all of its horrible realities. She saw too clearly the life of danger and hardship upon which her husband and her favorite brother had entered, and it overcame her strong and too sensitive mind. So she's going to fall into deeper depression. She's already worried about Jedediah, now her own husband. Now she's even more worried about her brothers after seeing the carnage from the Battle of Bunker Hill. Basically, she's going to some of the hospitals for the soldiers, these makeshift hospitals that were in the suburbs like Roxbury. She returns with her brother Jonathan, his wife, shortly after their traumatic visit to Boston. She decides, you know what, I need to go back to Connecticut, get away from this. I'll try to be with my family there and try to get through it okay, my depression. And here is an undated letter from the summer of 1775 in which she wrote to Jed, full of more emotion, more strong Christian faith wording. My dearest husband, wonder not, O best of men, when you see this paper that I take this method to address myself to you in the present occasion, sensible of my natural weakness, I find my heart too full for my tongue to speak, when thousands of tender ideas are crowding into my mind at the thoughts of parting with my dearest friend in life, perhaps to meet no more here below. I mean, what a beautiful and yet poignant and ominous way to write it, somber in ways. She's worried that he's going to be killed in battle. Possibly also, she doesn't say it specifically, but perhaps he might also die of disease. More soldiers die of disease in the war than died of battlefield wounds. Then, a few months later, in October 1775, on October 5th, Faith's brother, John Trumbull, writes to her from the American camp. He's trying to calm her down and let her know it's okay. He tries to write a reassuring letter and invites her to assist to visit him in hoping that it will cheer her up. And he writes, quote, we want nothing but housekeepers, such as my sister, to make our life quite comfortable. We live in peace and quietness here, as much as if our enemies were 1,000 miles from us. They do nothing to molest us at all, end quote. A week later, John writes to his brother David in Lebanon, asking, what can ail her? I thought she had more resolution, but I hope, however, that a little writing will restore her health. There were a lot of letters circling in the family, all these different brothers and parents and in-laws, trying to figure out what can we do to make Faith feel better about her situation. She eventually winds up moving back into Dedham, Mass. At this point, she's going to be up there for about a month. And thankfully, because of two people's diaries, we know exactly where she was staying and occasionally visited by her own husband, Jedediah. And that is the Henshaw family, the Henshaws, who are renting from Samuel Dexter. So this is called the Samuel Dexter House, which, as you can see, still stands. I got this from a real estate website. And we've been right by this house in Dedham, where I've spoken years ago. The Henshaws hosted Faith and Jed while she had treatment from a Dr. Sprague, who thankfully was prominent out of Harvard. He would have known Joseph Warren. He was trained at Harvard. He was a member of the Sons of Liberty and was quite talented and experienced with women who were suffering depression. He offered a course of physics, which included, of course, herbal remedies, and Jed would, of course, as I mentioned, visit frequently when he could obtain leave from Army camp under General George Washington and the army that was besieging the British-held Boston under General Thomas Gage. Well, Faith did have some improvement under Dr. Sprague, so that was encouraging, but there were still intermittent fits and delirium, and nothing seemed to be improving her over the long term. These are simply the portraits of the gentleman who had the house, Samuel Dexter, the namesake for the house on the left, who eventually moves to the northeast corner of Woodstock, Connecticut, and then this distinguished renter painted by John Singleton Copley on the right, Joshua Henshaw. But then there's Thanksgiving of 1775, and the Henshaws, very Class E family, invite all of the brothers, the Trumbull brothers and the Huntington brothers, there are 5 altogether of them in the theater of war here, stationed at both Roxbury and Cambridge, to come dine with them for Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving was a little different than what we think of in modern times. It's not always the same date. It would be called by George Washington or eventually Congress to say we're going to give thanks to God for whatever fortuitous events had recently occurred. So the date would fluctuate, but it was usually around that time of year, late November, early December. And unfortunately, the brothers cannot attend. They are called to duty. George Washington would not give them leave to come back to the Henshaws for the dinner. Unfortunately, that only makes her feel more depressed and draws her to make this fatal decision to go and find a small, short length of cord in the barn behind the house, and she hung herself in that barn. So she hanged and died that morning, apparently around 8:30 in the morning. And it's by 9:30 that morning that George Washington and Jedediah Huntington received the tragic news by express courier who goes on horseback to let them know this tragedy. This is an interesting quote that happened within a week later. Faith's virtues were praised, and her eternal disposition was not to be worried because, quote, God would not blame her for something she did as a result of his having taken away her reason, end quote. Faith's funeral is extremely well documented because of 2 different diaries from 2 different Dedham residents, but also because of the letters exchanged by Faith's family to other members, including her parents back here in Connecticut. Governor Trumbull and his wife were not able to scramble to get up there in time for the funeral, which was held 4 days after her suicide. One of the people who writes the diary is Jabez Fitch, who will be captured while serving under Jedediah Huntington at the Battle of Long Island. He keeps a diary during his being imprisoned in New York City, and it's amazing how much he wrote through the war, and unfortunately we don't have a likeness of him, any kind of portrait. There's a large turnout for Faith's funeral, both of civilians who were living in Dedham and then soldiers who knew Jedediah and his wife Faith, who were there in the area, who had come from Connecticut to serve, like Jabez Fitch. And they proceed from the house. They had a wake there that Jabez Fitch describes the details of how the wake was set up, even describing one of the carpets in the room. And she's laid out in an open coffin on display. Apparently that was tradition even for suicide. So they weren't trying to cover up the nature of her death and how controversial that would be. And the procession is just a couple blocks from the house down to the gravesite, which my wife and I have been to in Dedham. And she's interred in this crypt that you see a picture of. Just zooming in on, unfortunately, a poorly kept staircase into the crypt. There will be a repast or dinner at the nearby Ames's Tavern because she is buried in the Ames family crypt. And Jedediah is very upset at, of course, he goes into complete shock about this untimely death and the loss of a woman he loved so much. And so fortunately he was able to rally and be the important father to their son Jabez, and of course his duties as a officer in the American Revolution. And of course the question strikes me and my wife Pam and others who have found her story so compelling, what are we going to do to commemorate her, to remember her for the 250th anniversary this Thanksgiving? So we're starting to brainstorm what those plans might include. But I wanted to end on somewhat more of a positive note than just a woman who would commit suicide, to show you some of the legacy of Jedediah and faith. And it includes this portrait that my wife and I commissioned a painter to do, and this was just a few years ago, of Jedediah Huntington in his uniform. It's based on that miniature that you saw at the beginning of the talk where he's in a civilian coat. I wanted to see him in his uniform with his Society Cincinnati Eagle and his general's epaulets, and do it with the sheep in the background because he was important with his role of sending the sheep to Boston. So there they are, and there's his house that we so proudly own. And this is their lovely son. Remember that young Jabez, painted at 10 years old by his uncle John Trumbull? How lucky is he gets painted by a second famous painter. If you know anything about the visual arts, Ralph Earl, a second painter, will paint him in his army uniform in 1796 when he's in his 20s. Serving in the army for what eventually would lead to the so-called quasi-war with France in 1798. He served as an aide-de-camp to his uncle, Brigadier General Ebenezer Huntington. And this painting sold for over $100,000 about 4 years ago. Beautiful painting. Jedediah and Faith, I just wanted to remind you of their likenesses here. It's nice to have them paired together. It's the first time I've ever been able to present on Faith with her visual likeness. So it's powerful to be able to do that. And the legacies are with the homes that they have that still stand, and including the one that we own. Her childhood home, which is DAR's museum, the Governor Jonathan Trumbull / birthplace of John Trumbull, the painter, house, a national landmark. Her needlework that you saw, that we reproduced and hung in our dining room and in our master bedroom. And then perhaps most importantly, she did indeed, as I say, he said in his own words, inspire her younger brother, John Trumbull, to paint these. And John Trumbull not only painted himself many times, but a lot of family members, a lot of prominent generals. He will paint George Washington at least 5 times. And of course, we're all familiar with these history battle scenes that he did, about 8 of these, including this famous one, Bunker Hill. Again, the 250th anniversary coming this June 17th. And many famous Connecticut people are in that painting. Just wanted to also mention, before I close, my features on the Huntington family. If you have any interest in these, I'd be happy to email them to you. I've done magazine articles about the architectural and social history of the Huntingtons and the Trumbulls. And finally, I just have one final note about my forthcoming book. As Melissa mentioned, I'll just repeat. It's called Profiles of Patriots, Colonel John Trumbull and 5 Fellow Patriots from Connecticut in the American Revolution. And those include Colonels John and Jonathan Trumbull Jr., that's his older brother, their sister Faith, who you just learned about, her husband Colonel Jedediah, his younger half-brother Ebenezer Huntington, who becomes the second owner of our house, and he's a lieutenant colonel and second in command to someone named Samuel Webb, where we have another house of ours in Wethersfield. Samuel Webb is an amazing story. He will hold the Bible. He gets grazed by a bullet at Battle of Bunker Hill. He gets grazed 2 more times while serving as aide to General George Washington, including crossing the Delaware River that famous night in the snow. And then at the end of the story, he's holding the Bible for George Washington at his inauguration. So that's kind of a link to the inauguration we're about to experience again tomorrow. And I plan to release this book sometime this summer, 2025, for the 250th anniversary. So thank you again all for your patience and for coming to this wonderful presentation. I'm happy now to open the floor to questions and comments. And one more note, I almost forgot. Kind of like a show and tell type of thing. This is the magazine article that I pictured half of, that's cropped here, showing the front of our house. This is a women's history article, a feature on our house's history that I wrote 5 years ago. So come up and take a look at it if you want. And then these are examples blown up so you can see. It's like trick of the eye to see the embroidery here. When you come into our living room and our dining room and you see these, you think they're the originals because they're such high resolution reproduction pictures, basically. They're very high resolution photographs printed on, mounted, it's a canvas mounted onto the foam board and then framed. So it looks like the original. It's really fun what you can do with high resolution computer technology. So please, any questions? Yes, ma'am.
All I can sort of think of is collateral damage.
Mm-hmm.
And her, I'm sure you know a lot more about her trauma
Mm-hmm.
and other women. Which I know zippo about.
Sure. So, just like last week with Jerry Roberts, I'll repeat the question for the rest of you. The lady's asking, what do we, I guess we could attribute this as collateral damage, it's a modern term that we use, meaning how civilians are caught up as victims in a war, emotionally or physically. They could be battle wounded or killed, or they could have physical traumas, mental traumas, PTSD and what have you. And yes, there are other women. So the article that I would recommend is by Maggie Mehl, M-E-H-L. And if you were to email me, I could send you the link. Maggie lives on the Boston North Shore, and I met her through the process of her writing her social history of the Huntingtons, and I'm writing mine about Jedediah and the Trumbulls. So she's kind of taking it this slice, and I'm taking it as this slice, I guess, and we intersect in the American Revolution era. So we've been helping each other out. And so we were even trading some of these sets of letters that we had transcribed so that we didn't have to reinvent the wheel. We could share the labor responsibilities that way with research here in Connecticut. And I remember in reading her article, she mentions these other women. Now she happens to use examples in Connecticut, but it's not just Faith, of course. And I had mentioned a couple of these. There's one of Jedediah's sisters and then one of his sister-in-laws, this Hannah, who's his brother Joshua's wife, Hannah, I guess Huntington, and how they're depressed. Maggie goes into more detail in her article that she published about 2 years ago. It was in Connecticut History Review. I've been published in that as well. It's a blue paperback. It's published by University of Illinois Press, but it comes out of central Connecticut in New Britain. And she mentions different women in there and how they were dealing with their depression. Apparently, doctors were encountering this quite a bit. Dr. Sprague, who I mentioned in my presentation, was kind of seen as a local expert in depression, and it was affecting a lot of these people. What would you say, Pam? AKA Dr. Hall, the psychologist. What do we call that? What's the term? The psychosomatic response?
Psychosomatic illnesses.
Yeah.
Anxiety disorders.
Anxiety disorders, yeah, depression. So I would say in the general nature, this was not the Puritan New England of a century earlier, where something like suicide would have been seen as something tied to maybe witchcraft or something like that. That's 1692 is the Salem witch trials. There's many other accusations of witchcraft, including in Wethersfield in those same decades. By the 1760s and 70s, when people are unfortunately occasionally committing suicide or having severe depression, it seems like the religious community and the social community are trying to work through their Christian faith and their love in the community, feeling more, what would you say, holistically. So that was a positive development over the course of that century. These people weren't, what's the right term, banished or shunned. That would be the better word, shunned. Yep. So, for example, she has her funeral there, but there's also a sermon about her in her hometown by the minister, Reverend Williams, in Lebanon at the brick church that her brother John Trumbull will be the architect for decades later. And the minister, Reverend Williams, is talking about, coming to reason through our Christian faith. And it seems like to kind of begin wrapping up my answer to your question or the point you're trying to make, in Maggie Mehl's article, what I remember her saying is that each of these women, as would be appropriate for the time period, it seemed like they were each going to their Bible for answers, the power of prayer and so forth. And it's nice to see, having, since I've been married to a trauma psychologist whose mother happened to be a Yale-trained minister and graduate, that you could see the blend of psychology and divinity, or your faith, whether it be Christian or something else, and how that could work together. Of course, the most disturbing stuff, unfortunately, is using all kinds of crazy techniques to try to figure out how to relieve the depression. I'm not saying leeches in this particular case, that was for other stuff, but there were some medical treatments that I think nowadays we'd say, oh my goodness, what a shame that they did that to treat some of these people and they're try to cure their ails. But they were trying in a positive way with what little they had. Yes?
Is there any record of any other pregnancies?
Is there any evidence that she had any other pregnancies as perhaps demonstrated in letters from other family members? I haven't, that's a great question. I've never been asked. I've never seen any, nor has Maggie Neal. But I wouldn't be surprised if that's possible. You know, what's the medical term that we want to use for this? The depression act.
Postpartum depression.
Post what?
Postpartum.
Postpartum. I want to make sure I had that middle word correct. Postpartum depression, yes. Very possible that she might have had that perhaps she miscarried or something. I have no proof, and I'm not sure. Another interesting twist, and I'll leave you, this is an interesting little clue that we have stumbled on having researched her life along with Maggie Neal and others, is unfortunately she also had an uncle. I'm trying to think of his name. I think it's Joseph. His name is Joseph Trumbull, and the earlier family members spelled their last name different. It went from Trumble, that's how he spelled his name, to the traditional Trumbull that we have throughout this presentation. I guess they changed it for whatever reason. This Joseph Trumbull, I can't remember how old he was. I'm going to say he was a young adult, late teens, early 20s. He drowned due to mysterious circumstances in a pond in Lebanon. So it's curious, is there a history of mental illness? Because there's rumors that this was kind of a cover-up, that at that point when he had drowned, that it wasn't just like he had fallen through the ice. That this was something like, you know, when the pond would not have had any ice on it, so why would he have maybe intentionally drowned himself in this pond? He doesn't leave a suicide note, but you get inklings that there was circumstantial evidence from the family at the time. And so we're wondering, is there a biological tie or family dynamic tie between his depression and hers? We don't know, but it's interesting clues that we pick up in the course of our research. Yes?
I was just wondering, as an historian, looking at the cultures and history of all the other countries in the world, doesn't it astound you, the accomplishments of this country in a couple of 100 years?
Sure.
Could it be the combination of spiritual and physical values that gave us the strength that we have? And I was just wondering if you thought about that.
Sure. My personal belief is yes, there is something special. You're going to see this happening with the American Revolution. What makes the American Revolution different than, say, the French Revolution? Well, guess what? The French Revolution didn't answer to a higher power. They didn't answer to God, for example. It was about a very secular dynamic, the French Revolution. And so some historians, and I would join in on this camp, would say, and I remember studying this when I was an undergraduate, we had a whole seminar on the French Revolution, that ultimately the French Revolution failed because they were humanists who didn't answer to a higher power. You could see this with some of the other revolutions that failed. 1848, Europe, that's a big year in revolutions throughout the Habsburg dynasty and elsewhere. France, you would also see with the Russian Revolution of 1917 with the communists taking power under Vladimir Lenin. All these different revolutions, I think what sets the United States Revolution apart, and we can prove it with how long the U.S. Constitution has survived. We've had our Constitution since it was ratified in 1788. How many constitutions do you think countries like Italy have gone through? Dozens and dozens. So there's something special about the United States, and I think it does start with a very costly American Revolution, the incredible traumas that these families had to go through, as I've demonstrated. But I think the fact that it was based on these, different qualities that we refer to in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution, and of course the Bill of Rights is a special part in there too. It's what makes us unique, and I think because we keep going back to these founding documents as a reference point, it has kept us more stable through the centuries, and I think made us more special in world history. Yeah. Thank you.
How were fits described?
Okay, this lady's asking if one of the quotes from one of these letters was that she suffered from fits of delirium or what have you. What are these fits? How are they manifest? Don't know. In the course of our research, and Maggie Neal as well, I don't remember there being any further description.
A lot of crying.
For example, that would be the kind of thing if Dr. Sprague had kept a diary, maybe he would have explained what he had witnessed, in seeing her, convulsions, the kind of things you see with people with other kinds of ailments who have these. Unfortunately, he's not the one who kept the diary, it was two others who did. It's the Ames, it's a member of the family, Nathaniel Ames, who's not a doctor. He and his father had owned the tavern where they had the repast, the dinner after the funeral, and it's the Ames family crypt. And the other gentleman is Lieutenant Jabez Fitch, who is a young lieutenant in the Army. So neither one of them are doctors. So unfortunately, don't have much to go on there either, unfortunately. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Okay. What does it mean to transcribe letters? If you've heard this term, transcription or to transcribe, what does that entail? For me, at least, and I would think for a lot of people, in the old days, you'd get out, the Olivetti or whatever typewriter, like my dad or, the early version he would do, and there's the original letter, and you're trying to read the letter in its original handwriting, whatever that handwriting is. In this case, I'm getting with 1760s, 1770s. I've gone up to about as far as 1804 so far. I know especially some ladies in the background are going to love this. I've held a lot of Alexander Hamilton stuff. When I've held the Alexander Hamilton stuff at the Columbia Rare Books Library, that is just so powerful to hold all these original items. I've also held stuff at Mount Vernon's Fred Smith Library, letters from Jedediah and his second wife. He does remarry, by the way. I should mention that as a little P.S. He remarries to a woman named Ann Moore. And I'm holding their condolence letters to Martha Washington following the news of General George Washington's death. When I'm transcribing, whether it's the Fred Smith Library at Mount Vernon or Connecticut State Library or Yale, whatever medium they're handing me, whether it's microfilm or microfiche, but usually, thankfully I've been lucky, it's the original letters. I'm sitting there with my laptop, or I take a photo with my phone and go home and do the rest of it there. I'll tell you the toughest thing is whose handwriting is easier to read than others. George Washington's is easy to read. Jedediah Huntington's not so easy to read. Alexander Hamilton, not too bad. Kind of messy at times. It depends. Maybe if they had coffee that morning when they're trying to write it. I know that happens to me when I'm writing checks or something. Like, I shouldn't have that cup of coffee before I did this letter or a Christmas card or something. But that's really pretty much what it entails. I'll tell you what saved me. Just a little quick story, and then I'll wrap up here because I know we've run long. During the COVID pandemic that shut down this country, how did I handle researching and writing my book? Well, I said, you know what? I'm going to put it in religious terms. I said, God's closing one door. I can't just stand here and give all these presentations like I'm doing now. It's a unique opportunity. I'm going to be sequestered. I might as well finally have this other door that's open that I'm going to write that book. And I kept writing and writing. I had some author friends who were quite prominent who I'd met in New York City years ago, who's since passed away. One of them was Tom Fleming. He said, if you can, write 3 pages a day as you're writing. If you can do that, you'll be fine. He passed away of cancer before COVID. So I'm writing and going, I'm going to stick to that plan. I'm going to try what I can to write 3 pages. I should have asked him, by the way, were you referring to those 50 books you did of fiction or the 50 books you did of nonfiction? Because, wow, it's pretty tough with the nonfiction because there's research involved. And I got to tell you, it worked out great. I wrote 200,000 words during COVID, and into recovering from COVID as recently as early 2024. I said, my goodness, this is amazing. I have 200,000 words. I suddenly realized I don't have enough for one book. I have enough for 2 books. So my first book will come out this summer, and the second book hopefully will come out 3 years later. I have to tell you, to go back to tie a bow on transcription and wrap this up, what's amazing is how the internet has so many historical societies, as Melissa and others know, where these historical societies were doing so much work while they were shut down, getting stuff digitized, whether it was Yale or Connecticut Historical Society or organizations all over the place. Mount Vernon, the Huntington Library out in California has a bunch of these Huntington family letters. So many of them had been digitized and transcribed. So I didn't have to go through the work of trying to make an appointment or wait for COVID to reopen these places. I could do it all from the laptop right in my living room at my desk. Incredible. Very lucky that way. So come on up, sir.